It's a Marvel Monday. That means today I'm going to stop and rank all 7 MCU franchises from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of the 7 MCU franchises. When I say franchise, I mean there's more than one movie inside of the MCU right now. So that means no Incredible Hulk, no Doctor Strange, no Captain Marvel, and no Black Panther, because as of right now, they only have one movie inside of the MCU. When it comes to actually how I'm ranking them, it's based off quality, obviously, consistency, and does it feel like there's kind of a full arc throughout the movies that feels like it goes together, telling a complete story. With that said, one final thing before we get started. People ask me all the time where I get my posters and my Funko Pops. There's a link down below in the description and the pinned comment that can show you a list of a bunch of my posters and my Funkos and where you can pick them up as well. And let's get started. Coming in last place is the Thor franchise. Now, the character of Thor has had some of the best moments in the entire MCU. He's been consistently funny all along. He has a really powerful character arc, especially in Infinity War, and he gets some of the most awesome moments in the third acts of the Avengers films, such as when he shows up in the Battle of Wakanda, or just the stuff that he does while battling Thanos in Endgame. But his franchise, however, has been one of the most inconsistent and lowest quality of the franchises. Now, I would say that Thor Ragnarok is the high point. It was just so much fun. Taika Waititi just put such a distinct, unique flavor on the whole thing, from the color palette, the score, his unique and very distinct sense of humor, and just has a lot of awesome moments inside of it. But the three films feel wildly different from one another. Kenneth Branagh's film kind of has this sense of Shakespearean grandeur, and then it's like a fish out of water film. Thor: The Dark World, widely considered the worst film in the MCU, or one of the worst. Very bland direction, feels kind of like Lord of the Rings in space, but it just doesn't have anything that pops in the film. And then, of course, Thor Ragnarok is just this wild, crazy, campy space opera that's just jam-packed with jokes. But like Thor inside of Ragnarok does not at all feel like the same character that we saw in the previous two movies. There are some nice elements of his arc throughout it, as him trying to accept his place with Asgard and with his father and with his brother. Those elements I think do work, but overall, the first two Thor movies I think are some of the weakest and least consistent of the MCU, and they just don't fit with Thor Ragnarok at all. Therefore, the Thor franchise comes in last place for me. Number 6 is the Iron Man trilogy. Once again, maybe my favorite character in the MCU, has an incredible character arc from the guy in the cave to the guy that makes the choice at the end of Endgame, but his actual set of films, once again, isn't the most consistent trilogy, and it has some of the weakest movies in the entire MCU. On the positive side, I still think that the first Iron Man is one of the best movies in the entire MCU. You have this, because it doesn't have the weight of the rest of the MCU, you can just focus in on Tony Stark's journey, and there's so many powerful moments inside of it, especially now. They did a wonderful job of tying little lines of dialogue inside the cave between Tony and Pepper to what happens in Endgame, so the first Iron Man is even better in light of what happens in Endgame. Fortunately, the other two Iron Man movies I don't think quite live up to it. Iron Man 2, another one of the weakest films in the MCU. Clearly, they had to rush the script a little bit. That's been well documented. And they were trying to set up the Avengers. So there's just too many plot lines going on. But it just doesn't have a lot of urgency, momentum, anything like that. And so it's just kind of a letdown following the first film. And then Iron Man 3, I think, has a little bit more life to it, especially Shane Black's dialogue. A bunch of the action sequences I think really work, but it feels a little bit weird to go from movies about guys in suits to fire-breathing people. And what I think really knocks it back is that it felt like a fake finale to the trilogy because it closes out with him blowing up his suits and saying, I am Iron Man, but I'm having my heart fixed and I'm not sure if I'm Iron Man anymore. And then he shows up very soon afterwards in Age of Ultron, in which case it doesn't really make a real mark. It's not a real bookend, and it feels like it sets a bunch of things up that just don't really go anywhere. So this feels like a bit of a black sheep inside of the MCU because it didn't really move things forward. So unfortunately, as a set of movies, though I love the first one, the second two didn't quite close things out all that well. In 5th place is Guardians of the Galaxy. This one was so difficult for me to place because I absolutely love the first Guardians of the Galaxy. And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is one of the most disappointing films in the entire MCU for me. I know that is one of my hottest takes. I know a bunch of you like it. If you agree with me, the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is kind of a disappointment. Click that like button. And if you disagree with me, feel free to go ahead and click that dislike button. But for me, that first Guardians just did such a great job of having this group of misfits, bringing them together. And I think it's the most heartfelt film in the entire MCU, where you just really have this group of people that find their family coming together, going on this adventure. The dialogue is so snappy, plays out so well. And these non-heroes somehow end up becoming the Guardians of the Galaxy, and just has a fantastic, phenomenal soundtrack. This movie has such a special place in my heart. The second film, however, I think was just a really big misfire. Where the first one had so much heart, I think the second one got a little bit too nasty. Drax was too mean-spirited. There's sections where Baby Groot, who's a child, is tortured. There's scenes where people are like murdered while others are laughing. And the next shot is like Looney Tunes humor. I didn't really like any of the villains inside of the film. The Sovereign were just too corny and goofy. And then Ego, I know some people love him, but the way the story plays out was just distasteful. To have an orphan finally find his father only to discover that he murdered thousands of his siblings that he didn't know that he had. That didn't really sit right with me. I didn't really like any of the action sequences, besides that one with Rocket doing the stealth stuff. Even though it continued a lot of the arcs, I didn't really like where it took any of those arcs that they continued, except maybe the Yondu stuff. I thought that stuff worked really well. But otherwise, you got one movie that I just love, and the other one that every time I rewatch it, I like it a little bit less. Next up is the Ant-Man series. Unlike the previous 3 entries on this, where I thought there were some real high points, and then some low points. With the Ant-Man series, I think both the movies are just kind of right there in the middle of the pack. And I think that that is where they belong. Where certain movies in the MCU are really swinging for the fences, going for a home run, and some of them knocked it out of the park, and some of them kind of didn't quite live up to their ambitions. The Ant-Man movies are just trying to hit a solid double. They want to entertain, they're tied to this bigger universe, but they're not intended to be the biggest, flashiest, most groundbreaking movies in the MCU. They're just trying to be some lighthearted, soft adventures, and I think they did a pretty good job at it, especially when you think about the history of the first Ant-Man movie, that Edgar Wright was working on the project for like 13 years, and pretty last minute, he ended up leaving. Peyton Reed comes in, and Paul Rudd and Adam McKay have to work on the script. It still feels very consistent. It doesn't feel like this movie that was like cobbled together. And I thought the second one was actually a little bit better. Some people don't like the second one. I dig it just as much as the first one, maybe a little bit more, because it's just a lighthearted MacGuffin story about 3 different groups of people trying to get this one thing, and they keep tracking it down and shuffling hands. And it's not trying to be Infinity War. It's not trying to even be like Ragnarok. It's just a simple little fun adventure with a lot of humor that is easy to consume. The 2 movies build well on each other, especially as you kind of have this rescue mission with Hank Pym going in for his wife, the Wasp actually getting to go into action in the second film. Put them together. It's not the biggest thing in the MCU, but it's exactly what it's trying to be. Real quick before I give you my final three, remember to share your ranking down below in the comment section. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. We can have a lively discussion where we disagree. Let's just keep it respectful, and if you gotta do something, just click that dislike button. No reason to be mean. Also, after this video, if you want more content like this, check out this playlist up above. I have done all kinds of Marvel rankings that you can check out while in quarantine. The heroes, the villains, the final battles, the trilogies, the movies, all of it. Check it out right up there. In third place is the Spiderman Homecoming films. Once again, kind of like the Ant-Man films, these aren't trying to be the most epic stories in the Marvel universe. They're trying to tell the story about a high schooler who wants to be a hero and he wants to be a normal high schooler, and I think they've done a pretty good job at that. I enjoy the first film a good bit more than the second one. Does a great job of giving us the most high school Peter Parker that we've ever had. He's even going on field trips and things like that. And we get to see his friends and meet them a little bit. Love the villain that they included in that film in Vulture, how it tied into his character arc and everything like that. And just establishing another lighthearted series in this universe that feels a little bit more personal. I did enjoy Far From Home. I had a few more issues with it because I didn't think the plot entirely worked with the Edith glasses. I didn't think there's a lot of sense in the idea that Tony Stark would give them to Peter Parker, and that kind of knocks the story back a little bit for me. Doesn't mean it's not a fun film for me. Really enjoy Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, and he just kind of gets to chew up certain scenes. Obviously a very funny movie as well. And they go really nicely together, kind of continuing this idea of a high school Peter Parker now going on an actual trip to Europe. All of it feels like a nice extension of the first film and continuing the journey of Peter trying to figure out his place as a hero with all these other characters and everything else going on. It's not necessarily my favorite movies, but once again, like the Ant-Man ones, they know their place and they do a good job at what they're trying to do. Our runner-up is the Captain America trilogy. Steve Rogers gets one of the best arcs in the MCU throughout his films, which sets up what happens in Infinity War quite well. We start off with Steve Rogers in World War II, establishing him as kind of this old-fashioned kind of guy with traditional morality, a pretty good moral compass, and then he finds himself as a fish out of water in his later two films and realizing the world has changed and isn't as simple as Nazis bad anymore, and he's having to figure out what to do with a government that he can't trust, and eventually he's put in a scenario with he's having to compete against his former teammates because of differing opinions and ideologies. I think that just makes for a very powerful arc throughout the film of him absolutely believing in the team and can't wait to sign up at the beginning of the first Captain America and then turning in his shield at the end of Captain America's Civil War. Very powerful stuff. Now, there is a bit of a tonal shift in consistency between First Avenger and then Winter Soldier. But I think in this case it makes sense because that movie was set at a different point in time, so you want to have a very big shift in tone to what's going on. You get the war movie, you get the political thriller, and then you have the film about different loyalties. So each feels distinct, but they're a continuation of that same arc with the character. I would say the weakest of the three films is First Avenger, but I still think it's very good. The first hour with his kind of origin story, some of my favorite stuff in the entire MCU. For a lot of people, Winter Soldier is the best movie in this entire franchise. And then for me, Civil War, of course, has just so many great moments. And I love that the tension inside of it is based off different ideologies and the consequences of what has come before. All of it works great for me. It feels like a complete trilogy, and you really see the character grow and change throughout the films. This is a very good, solid trilogy. But easily coming in first place for me is the Avengers franchise. This is the MCU swinging for the fences, and 3 out of the 4 times, I would say they hit it out of the park. And that fourth time, they still got on base. For me, what they were able to do with that first Avengers film in cracking the code for how to take all these different franchises, bring the characters together, and feel like it had a consistent tone to it was quite remarkable. Likewise, Infinity War is my favorite film in the MCU, where you get to see all these franchises, even more, coming together. And then, of course, Endgame, the magnum opus of the Infinity Saga, this big, massive story that managed to pull it all off. And then, of course, you do have Age of Ultron in the middle there that I think most everyone would say is the weakest of all of them. I don't think it's a bad movie, though. I think it's just a little bit overstuffed. But if you look at the movies as a set of films, the first one is where they come together. The second one is where you start to see the cracks form in the team. The third one is where they absolutely fail. And the fourth one is the epic comeback. It's a story in and of itself that works, and it keeps building upon the previous ones to escalate all of the awesomeness that started with the first film. When I think of what just like the biggest, most awesome moments in the MCU are, a whole lot of them are inside of the Avengers films. And just as someone that's grown up reading comics, watching comic book cartoons, and having a toy box filled with these action figures, this was like a dream coming true that we actually got a set of Avengers films and they worked. They actually worked. These movies have the highest ambitions and they pulled it off. They tried to do something very difficult and they actually did it. I mean, that final hour in Endgame, it's remarkable how well it pays off so many things from everything that's come before in the MCU and just puts a big grin on your face, makes you start crying just because portals start opening, and then it makes you cry again as Tony Stark makes the ultimate sacrifice. For me, there's no question, there's no debate. The Avengers franchise is easily the best of the MCU franchises and the one that puts the biggest grin on my face. If you've enjoyed this video and want more just like it, you can check out that playlist right there. I've ranked the movies, the heroes, the villains, the final battles, the directors, and if you want my reviews of all of the Marvel movies, it's right down there. I've done a spoiler, big, massive review of each of them. Check it out down there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.